December 16th, 1944. Early morning. Mona, Germany. The frozen earth trembled as another salvo of American artillery screamed overhead. But something was different this morning. Terrifyingly, incomprehensibly different. The shells weren't striking the ground or the trees. They were detonating in midair, precisely above the advancing German positions, creating a lethal rain of steel fragments that no foxhole could protect against. Among the 326th Volk Grenadier Division attacking the 38th Cavalry Squadron's positions, soldiers who had survived years on the Eastern Front encountered something that defied their understanding of warfare. These weren't the artillery patterns they knew, the predictable impacts, the safe zones, the protective value of entrenchments. This was death delivered from above with mathematical precision. At that moment, Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson of the 406th Artillery Group had just made one of the most consequential unauthorized decisions of the Battle of the Bulge. Against standing orders without permission from higher command, he had ordered his gunners to load shells equipped with the most closely guarded secret in the Allied arsenal, proximity fuses. These devices, containing miniature radar systems that could detect their distance from targets and detonate at the optimal height, would multiply artillery lethality by a factor of 50. The mathematics of death were about to be rewritten in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. What the German soldiers couldn't know was that they had just encountered a weapon so revolutionary that it would transform not just this battle but the very nature of warfare itself. The storm unleashed. Operation Watch on the Rhine had begun with tremendous promise for the Wehrmacht. Hitler's last gamble involved 200,000 German soldiers, 1,000 tanks, and nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, all masked in secret through the fog-shrouded Ardennes. The Führer had assured his generals that this offensive would split the Allied armies and recapture Antwerp, turning the tide of a war that was slipping inexorably toward defeat. The initial bombardment at 0530 hours on December 16th had achieved complete tactical surprise. German artillery fired at a rate of 1,600 rounds per minute along the 85mm front. American intelligence had failed catastrophically. They hadn't detected the massive buildup, and many frontline units were either green replacements or exhausted veterans sent to this quiet sector for rest. But at Monshaw, Colonel Axelson faced an impossible tactical situation. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, a small reconnaissance unit, was being overwhelmed by superior German forces. Conventional artillery couldn't stop the assault. In desperation, Axelson made his historic decision. Deploy the secret proximity-fused shells without authorization. He would later face potential court-martial for this choice, but in that moment he recognized that following orders meant certain defeat. The effect was immediate and devastating. German soldiers advancing in traditional assault formations suddenly found themselves under a type of fire they had never experienced. The shells exploded 30 to 50 feet above them, each detonation creating a cone of fragments that covered vastly more area than conventional ground-burst shells. Veterans who knew how to take cover from normal artillery were cut down in their foxholes, behind trees, in ditches, anywhere they sought shelter. The secret science of death. The proximity fuse represented the convergence of American scientific innovation and industrial capacity at their absolute peak. Unlike conventional shells that required direct impact or time fuses that often detonated at wrong heights, the proximity fuse contained a self-contained radar system no larger than a coffee can. Inside each fuse, American engineers had packed 130 electronic components, including 4 or 5 miniature vacuum tubes. Depending on the model, that could withstand the incredible 20,000 times gravity force of being fired from an artillery piece. The physics involved were staggering. At the moment of firing, the acceleration would crush a glass ampule containing electrolyte, creating a battery that powered the tiny radar for the shell's flight duration. Dr. Merle Tuve at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory had driven this development with Manhattan Project level intensity. The laboratory, disguised as an abandoned used car dealership in Silver Spring, Maryland, employed 3% of all American physicists at peak production. Security matched that of the atomic bomb program. Workers couldn't discuss their work, even with families. and each fuse carried a unique serial number for tracking. The technical challenge had seemed insurmountable. Vacuum tubes designed for living room radios had to be completely redesigned to survive being fired from cannons. They had to function while spinning at extreme rotational speeds, work in all weather conditions, and be sensitive enough to detect targets without premature detonation. The breakthrough came through miniaturization techniques that would later revolutionize the electronics industry. Dr. James Van Allen's tubes were no larger than pencil erasers, yet contained all the elements of conventional radio tubes. By December 1944, American factories were producing 40,000 proximity fuses daily. Over 100 companies contributed to the effort, from RCA and General Electric to Sylvania and Crossley Corporation. The program's cost reached $1 billion in 1940s dollars, second only to the Manhattan Project in wartime spending. Authorization crisis and expansion. Axelson's unauthorized use on December 16th created an immediate command crisis. He had violated direct orders restricting proximity fuses to anti-aircraft use, fearing that captured examples might be reverse-engineered by the Germans. But the devastating effectiveness at Mona was undeniable. The German attack had been stopped cold with casualties that shocked both sides. Word of the weapon's impact reached Supreme Headquarters rapidly. General Eisenhower, recognizing the desperate situation developing across the Ardennes, formally requested authorization on December 19th. By December 21st, all restrictions were lifted and proximity fuses were released for general ground combat use across the entire Bulge battlefield. The rapid distribution that followed demonstrated American logistical superiority. Within days, proximity-fused shells were being delivered to artillery units throughout the Ardennes. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion at Bastogne received their allocation just as the German ring closed around the town. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion, with their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers, began using them to defend the northwest approaches. The 969th Artillery Battalion, an African-American unit commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Hubert D. Barnes, employed them with devastating effect southwest of Bastogne. Each unit discovered the same truth. Proximity fuses transformed artillery from a support weapon into a decisive battlefield tool. Forward observers no longer needed to carefully adjust fire. The fuses would find their own optimal detonation point. Accuracy requirements decreased while lethality increased exponentially. Bastogne, surrounded but superior. The siege of Bastogne provided the perfect demonstration of proximity fuses in defensive warfare. The 101st Airborne Division, completely surrounded and outnumbered, held the vital crossroads against repeated German assaults. Their artillery support included the 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with 75mm pack howitzers, capable of firing proximity-fused shells. Between December 19th and 31st, the 463rd fired exactly 776 rounds, according to official unit records. While not all were proximity-fused due to limited supply, those that were had devastating psychological and physical effects. German assault formations simply melted away under the airburst barges, with entire platoon eliminated in seconds. The December 22nd attack, following General McAuliffe's famous nuts reply to the German surrender demand, showcased the weapon's effectiveness. German infantry advancing across snow-covered fields in traditional formations were caught in the open. The proximity-fused shells detonated overhead with precise timing, creating overlapping patterns of destruction that left no safe zones. The all-African Amiens 969th Artillery Battalion played an equally crucial role. Their 155mm howitzers created a ring of death around Baston's perimeter that German forces found impenetrable. The larger shells, detonating at 50 feet, covered even greater areas with lethal fragments. German prisoners later reported that attacking units often lost cohesion before even reaching American lines, with soldiers fleeing the incomprehensible airbursts. The Sauer River slaughter. Perhaps the most thoroughly documented demonstration of proximity-fused lethality occurred at the Sauer River near Ecton on December 25th to 26th. General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was driving north to relieve Bastogne, personally witnessed this engagement and recorded it in his memoir, War as I Knew It. A German battalion attempting to cross the partially frozen river believed they were hidden by darkness and fog from American observers. Traditional artillery would have required careful adjustment of fire, giving the Germans time to complete their crossing or seek cover, but proximity-fused shells needed no such adjustment. Patton wrote, "We caught a German battalion crossing the Sauer. The new posit ammunition was devastating. The shells burst in the air above them. They had nowhere to run. The river behind them, our fire in front and above. When the firing stopped, we counted 702 bodies. This figure, 702 killed by actual count, represents one of the few precisely documented casualty figures from proximity-fuse employment. The mathematical efficiency was stark. A single battalion essentially ceased to exist in minutes with no possibility of escape or defense. The psychological impact spread throughout German units in the sector, with soldiers refusing orders to conduct river crossings. Forest warfare transformed. The Ardennes dense forests, which Germans counted on for concealment, became death traps when proximity fuses entered the equation. In open terrain, a proximity fuse detonating at 30 to 50 feet was deadly enough. But in forests, the effects multiplied exponentially. The air bursts shattered tree branches, creating thousands of additional wooden projectiles. These splinters, some as long as a man's arm, traveled at hundreds of feet per second with lethal effect. Traditional defensive positions, taking cover behind large trees, digging foxholes under root systems, became useless. The fragments and splinters came from above, negating centuries of tactical wisdom about forest fighting. American artillery units quickly recognized this multiplier effect. A single proximity-fused 155mm shell detonating above the forest canopy could clear an area the size of a tennis court of all living things. The combination of metal fragments from the shell and wooden splinters from the trees created a 360-degree kill zone that no amount of tactical skill could evade. German units trained in forest warfare found their expertise worthless. Spreading out to avoid concentrated casualties made units vulnerable to the wide area effects. Bunching together for mutual support meant entire squads could be eliminated by single shells. There was no correct tactical response to this new threat. Technical supremacy in action. The proximity fuse operated on principles that seemed like science fiction to 1940s soldiers. Each fuse contained a tiny radio transmitter operating at 180 to 220 megahertz, continuously sending out waves that reflected off objects, ground, trees, vehicles, human bodies. As the shell approached its target, the reflected signal strengthened. When it reached predetermined intensity corresponding to optimal burst height, an electronic switch triggered detonation. The entire system had to function under conditions that would destroy normal electronics. During firing, the acceleration reached 20,000 times Earth's gravity, enough to crush a human body to microscopic thickness. The shells spun at rates that created massive centrifugal forces. Temperatures ranged from gun barrel heat of 3,000 degrees on F to sub-zero conditions at trajectory peak. Yet the delicate vacuum tubes protected by innovative cushioning systems survived and functioned with over 80% reliability. The optimal burst heights had been determined through extensive testing at Ardennes, proving ground for 105mm howitzers. The standard divisional artillery piece 30 feet proved ideal. The 155mm guns achieved maximum lethality at 50 feet. The rare 240mm shells created devastating effects at 70+ feet, capable of clearing entire grid squares of enemy forces. This technological superiority translated directly into battlefield dominance. Studies showed proximity fuses increased lethality by 5 to 10 times over conventional shells. The lethal fragment area increased by a factor of 50. Anti-aircraft applications showed even more dramatic improvements. Shooting down V-1 flying bombs improved from 17% to 79% success rate within weeks of proximity fuse deployment. Intelligence failures and German confusion. The German intelligence failure regarding proximity fuses proved catastrophic. In December 1944, Wehrmacht forces overran an American ammunition depot. capturing approximately 20,000 proximity-fused shells. This intelligence windfall should have led to immediate countermeasure development. Instead, German technical experts examined the captured fuses and declared them impossible. The presence of vacuum tubes in an artillery shell contradicted everything German engineers believed about electronics and ballistics. They concluded the Americans were using some form of magnetic detection, or that the visible components were decoys hiding the real mechanism. This failure stemmed partly from institutional blindness. Germany had actually led proximity fuse development before the war. Rheinmetall Borsig and AEG Berlin had working prototypes by 1940. But Hitler's order canceling all weapons projects requiring more than 6 months to production had terminated the program. German engineers couldn't believe the Americans had solved problems they themselves had abandoned. The irony deepened when considering German technical capabilities. Their electrostatic proximity fuses showed 95% reliability in tests using electrical capacitance changes rather than radar. Had development continued, Germany might have fielded proximity fuses by 1941. Hermann Göring would later admit during interrogation that German fuses were 3 or 4 months from production when the war ended. The Christmas catastrophe. December 25, 1944 brought no holiday respite. German units attempting to use Christmas for resupply and reorganization discovered that proximity fuses recognized no ceasefires. Field kitchens, supply convoys, and assembly areas came under devastating bombardment that required no forward observers. The 420th Armored Field Artillery Battalion alone fired over 1,000 rounds on Christmas Day, most proximity fused. Their M7 Priest self-propelled howitzers delivered rapid, accurate fire that caught German units completely unprepared. The ability to fire effectively without observation in poor weather during darkness transformed artillery from a daylight weapon into a 24-hour threat. The psychological impact was severe. German soldiers had learned to move during poor weather when Allied aircraft couldn't fly and observers couldn't spot them. Proximity fuses eliminated this sanctuary. Death could arrive at any moment in any weather with no warning beyond the brief whistle of incoming shells. Malmedy and Scorzini's elite. On December 21st, SS Colonel Otto Scorzini's elite commandos attempted to capture Malmedy. These weren't ordinary soldiers, but specially selected troops who had rescued Mussolini, nearly captured Tito, and infiltrated American lines wearing U.S. uniforms. They represented the best Germany could field. They met devastating proximity-fused artillery fire that transformed their American disguises from tactical advantage to death shrouds. The shells exploded overhead with uncanny precision, as if they could detect the imposters below. While exact casualty figures remain disputed, the attack failed catastrophically with heavy losses that ended Scorsese's offensive operations. The psychological breakdown among elite SS troops proved particularly significant. These soldiers, indoctrinated with beliefs in German superiority and trained to the highest standards, found themselves helpless against American technology. Some survivors reportedly charged directly toward American lines, preferring quick death to continued bombardment, a complete breakdown of military discipline among Hitler's most fanatical troops. Industrial achievement. The production miracle behind proximity fuses matched any wartime industrial achievement. By December 1944, over 100 American companies had converted to fuse production. The Crosley Corporation abandoned refrigerator manufacturing for fuse assembly. Emerson Radio retooled from home electronics to weapons production. Sylvania, RCA, and General Electric dedicated entire facilities to the program. Quality control exceeded anything previously attempted in mass production. Each of the 130 components underwent individual testing. Every solder joint was inspected under magnification. Random samples were actually fired to ensure survival under combat conditions. The rejection rate was ruthless. Any component showing slight deviation was discarded. The workforce, predominantly women, maintained this precision while working 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. They couldn't know what they were making due to security compartmentalization. They only knew it was vital to the war effort. By December 1944, they were producing one proximity fuse every 2 seconds around the clock. The cost reduction achieved was remarkable. In 1942, each fuse cost $732 more than a worker's annual salary. By December 1944, mass production had driven costs to $18 per unit while maintaining quality. This efficiency allowed the production of 22 million fuses during the war, with 200,000 deployed during the Battle of the Bulge alone. Patton's arithmetic. General Patton understood proximity fuses' value better than perhaps any commander. His Third Army, driving to relieve Bastogne, used them as a breakthrough weapon. His artillery commander, Brigadier General Edward Williams, developed new tactics specifically for proximity fuse employment. Williams pioneered the time-on-target concentration using proximity fuses, multiple battalions firing simultaneously so shells arrived together, when dozens of proximity-fused shells detonated simultaneously at optimal height. The effect was apocalyptic. German soldiers called it the bell toll of death. In the week between December 22nd and 29th, Patton's Third Army fired 50,000 proximity-fused shells. The results were decisive in breaking German resistance and opening the corridor to Bastogne. Patton himself wrote, "The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. Elsenborn Ridge holds the Battle of Elsenborn Ridge demonstrated proximity fuses at maximum effectiveness." Here, the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held critical terrain against the 6th SS Panzer Army, including the elite 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Over 3 days, December 17th to 19th, American artillery fired 160,000 rounds, with approximately 40,000 being proximity fused. These 25% of shells accounted for an estimated 60% of the 5,000-plus German casualties. The mathematics were undeniable. Proximity fuses multiplied American firepower by a factor of 4. The German attacks launched repeatedly up the steep, forested slopes met walls of airburst steel. Entire companies disappeared in seconds. Bodies piled so thick that subsequent waves had to climb over their own dead. After 3 days, the attacks ceased. The elite of the Waffen-SS had been broken by American technology. Operation Bodenplatter's destruction. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe launched Operation Bodenplatter, 900 fighters attacking Allied airfields. The surprise was complete, catching many Allied aircraft on the ground. But returning German pilots met walls of proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire. Of 277 German aircraft lost that day, 172 fell to anti-aircraft guns, most using proximity fuses. The kill rate stunned both sides. German pilots trained to evade predictive anti-aircraft fire found shells detonating precisely where they would cause maximum damage. The Luftwaffe, already crippled, never recovered from these losses. Breaking the secret. By early January 1945, maintaining secrecy became impossible. Too many shells had been fired. Too many soldiers had witnessed their effects. On January 6th, the War Department authorized limited disclosure. The New York Times reported on a new type of artillery shell that multiplies the effectiveness of American guns without explaining the technology. German intelligence finally grasped the weapon's significance too late. A January 10th report from Foreign Armies West stated, "The Americans possess a radio-controlled artillery fuse that detonates shells at optimal height for anti-personnel effect. This weapon has caused severe casualties among our forces in the Ardennes. No effective countermeasures exist." Strategic Impact Assessment. Post-war analysis revealed proximity fuses' decisive impact. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stated, "The proximity fuse was decisive. Our attacks broke down not because of American courage, though they fought well, but because of artillery that seemed to have eyes." General Hasso Montoyel, 5th Panzer Army commander, testified, "The American artillery was the terror of our soldiers, especially the new shells that exploded in the air. They caused panic even among veteran troops." The statistics tell the story. 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired, accounting for an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties, up to 20% of total German losses. The weapon achieved 5 to 10 times greater effectiveness than conventional ammunition while requiring no forward observation in poor weather. The human cost. Behind every statistic lay human tragedy. German soldiers, many of them teenagers conscripted in the war's final stages, died in ways that traditional warfare had never contemplated. They were killed by weapons that seemed to possess intelligence that could find them wherever they hid. American production workers paid their own price. Factory accidents were hushed up for security. Workers at Crossley Corporation, Emerson Radio, and other facilities suffered breakdowns from stress and exhaustion. They produced weapons of unprecedented lethality without knowing what they were making, carrying that burden in enforced silence. Yet the moral calculation of war is never simple. The Battle of the Bulge cost 19,000 American lives. Without proximity fuses, how many more would have died? How much longer would the war have lasted? How many more Holocaust victims would have perished while battles raged? Every day the war shortened, potentially saved thousands in concentration camps awaiting liberation. Technological legacy. The proximity fuse program generated advances that transformed post-war technology. The miniaturized vacuum tubes became foundations for modern electronics. Quality control procedures established for fuse production became industry standards. The organizational methods coordinating hundreds of suppliers pioneered modern supply chain management. Dr. James Van Allen applied his miniaturization expertise to satellite instrumentation, later discovering Earth's radiation belts. The radar principles evolved into modern systems. The concept of autonomous sensors making decisions became the foundation for guided missiles and eventually all smart weapons. Every precision-guided munition today descends from the proximity fuse, the first weapon that could sense its environment and choose when to detonate. The revolution begun in the Ardennes continues on modern battlefields where smart weapons dominate warfare. Final reckoning. The Battle of the Bulge ended. January 25, 1945, with German forces in full retreat. Hitler's last offensive had cost Germany approximately 100,000 casualties while achieving nothing. American losses totaled 75,000, including 1,000 killed. The proximity fuse had proven itself not just as a weapon, but as a war winner. General Eisenhower's assessment that German possession of proximity fuses might have made D-Day exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible, underscores their strategic importance. They weren't merely an artillery improvement, but a revolutionary technology that fundamentally changed warfare's mathematics. The German soldiers who faced proximity-fused artillery experienced something unprecedented. Death delivered by shells that seemed intelligent, that could find them anywhere, that transformed the very air into a killing zone. Their experience marked warfare's transformation into the technological age, from Colonel Axelson's unauthorized first use on December 16, 1944, through the systematic deployment of 200,000 shells across the Ardennes. Proximity fuses demonstrated that scientific innovation could provide decisive military advantage. The convergence of American industrial capacity, scientific genius, and tactical adaptation created a weapon that helped determine the war's outcome. The proximity fuse story is ultimately about transformation, technological, tactical, and human. It proved that industrial democracy could produce weapons of devastating effectiveness, that innovation could overcome numerical disadvantage, that the side with superior science would likely prevail. These lessons shaped not just World War II's remainder, but the entire structure of warfare that followed. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the age of technological warfare truly arrived. The mathematics of death were rewritten by tiny radar sets in artillery shells, forever changing how humans wage war. The German soldiers who died beneath proximity-fused airbursts were casualties not just of a particular battle, but of a revolution in military affairs that continues shaping our world today.